And then sharing my screen. Hopefully I see when they come in. Okay. Like I said, the book of Amos is not really a well-known book. We don't have a lot of sermons from Amos. There are one or two verses that some pastors may quote, but for most Christians, this is one of those lost books of the Bible in a sense, because we really just don't pay attention to it very much. It is part of the collection known as the minor prophets to Christians, not to the Jews. The Jews is just one of the prophet books, but Christians know it as a minor prophet, not because they were minor, but because maybe their books are not as long or as influential as some of the others. Mrs. Manjit, you may need to check your sound there. I'm not sure it's from my end. In the Jewish scripture scrolls, the 12 minor prophets are all within one scroll. That's another reason that they were called the minor prophets by Christians, because while Isaiah is one scroll by himself, Jeremiah one scroll by himself, these 12 prophets are in one scroll. It's not a short book. There are 9 chapters, so it's a fairly lengthy book. What we will do tonight is get introduced into Amos so that we can have a sense of what to expect in the book, especially when we look at the very, very, very intricate structure of the book of Amos. He was quite a writer. We know a little bit about him, but not enough to know how he achieved this level of writing when we look at his job descriptions, what he says about himself. And so we will meet the author, we will meet a little bit about the man. We know quite a bit about his profession before he became a prophet. But we need to also keep in mind that Amos is an example of how prophets did not always have a full-time ministry. He was one of them. When you look at all the prophets in the Bible, there were some that had a lifelong ministry: Elijah, Elisha, Samuel, Isaiah, Jeremiah. But many of these minor prophets, or most of the minor prophets, their ministry seems to have been rather abbreviated ones. One or two of them, Amos seems to be one of them, who was given a specific set of messages, and once those were delivered, his ministry was kind of over. And so we need to keep that in mind as well, because most Christians have this view that if you are a prophet, then you are a prophet for life. But being a prophet is about bringing a message from God. And if that message has a fixed time limit, so to speak, a shelf life that did not require the... Anybody else, Sanki? Just a minute. And so he was one of those who would have delivered his message, and we get a clear picture that once he did that, he was like, okay, I'm done. He also had a run-in with the, well, he was called the high priest in Samaria, but this is not really of the main temple. So there was a contestation between the two offices of priest and prophet. So let's get into the book. First of all, is who was Amos? What do we really know about him? Now, interestingly, he gives us 3 different job descriptions. The first one, he says that he is a sheep raiser. The Hebrew word is noged. Now, I'm going to give you the Hebrew words because it helps us to differentiate what the English cannot. Most English translations call him a shepherd, but this is not the word for shepherd. This word describes a man who maybe has multiple flocks, who specialize in raising new flocks. In other words, kind of a rancher in our modern terms. And this is added by another information he gives about himself as a herdsman. He describes himself as boker. Boker is the same word that is often used for cattle and donkeys, herds of domestic animals, probably includes horses as well. So the picture we have here is of a man with substance, a businessman, not a shepherd the way that David was, but rather a shepherd more in the modern sense of a sheep owner, some ranch and so on. Then he also tells us that he was a caretaker of sycamore trees. Now, this word caretaker is the Hebrew word is difficult to translate because we don't have parallels to compare it with. We don't know if this meant that he owned vineyard, sycamore vineyard, sycamore farms, or if he just had a few trees and the sycamores had to be pruned and treated right, depending on the weather. But again, all three words seem to indicate a man of substance with a lot of means. He owns a lot of animals. He owns an entire orchard, if you like. And so we're talking here about somebody who, in our world today, we would say was a businessman with multiple companies in his hands. So he was not your typical prophets. Most of the prophets were either from the priestly family or from the aristocracy. So Isaiah was from the aristocracy, Daniel was from the aristocracy, whereas Ezekiel and Jeremiah were from the priestly clan. Samuel was a priest. We don't know too much about Elijah and Elisha, where they came from. And we know that Haggai, Zechariah were priests. Habakkuk was a Levite. And so he would have been very different from everyone because he comes from what we would say today the secular world, but clearly a man who had a strong connection with God. He also tells us something that no other prophet ever said. When he was challenged about what right he had to come and give a message and speak about judgment to Israel, his target was mainly the northern kingdom of Israel. He tells them, he said, I am not a prophet or the son of a prophet. By the way, the term son of the prophet means that you are seminary trained. Now we know that there were schools of sons of the that were called the sons of the prophets. Elisha had one. Samuel had one. Isaiah had one. So he was not a seminary student. To think of it in those terms, we would say he was not, again, Paki Jimmy, I still don't see Mr. and Mrs. Tan. Sorry. He was not a theology professor. Hi, Guri, welcome back. He was not a seminary student. In other words, in modern parlance, he would say, I'm not a professional prophet. See, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, they were considered major prophets because their ministry was lifelong. This was not his profession. He was a noked, he was a boker, he was a farmer. That was his profession, not ministry, which tells us that his ministry was temporary. It had a certain message, a certain period of time, and that's about it. We do know where he came from, a place called Tekoa. The name appears in a few Bible stories. But what is important is that it's quite near to Bethlehem, walking distance to Bethlehem. So the same vicinity as David, as most of the kings of Judah, and then of Jesus himself. The name Tekoa appears even in the New Testament as well. Now, the time of his ministry is extremely important. He tells us that Uzziah was king of Judah and Jeroboam too was king of Israel. Now, what's important about these two men? Their reign overlapped more or less the same time. Jeroboam too was the northern kingdom of Israel. Uzziah was the kingdom of Judah. But between the two of them, these kings raised those two countries to the same height, politically, economically, that it had at the time of Solomon. These are the only 2 points in the history of Israel that they reached that height of development. Solomon's time, and then Jeroboam too and Uzziah. In other words, this was the best of times. Both countries were prosperous. They didn't really fight much with each other during these two kings. Apparently, the two kings got along much better than most kings of Judah and Israel. They saw the countries at a high point of political influence. Uzziah even had a naval fleet using the Gulf of Aqaba, which was built originally by Solomon. And so this was, we don't know if Jeroboam too had a marine fleet. He probably did, because he had access to Haifa and some of those other ports in the Mediterranean. There was less war for these two nations to fight. They were the regional powers. So in that entire little world that we call the Bible world, these were the two prominent kings. But he also gives us one very important piece of information that has never been verified. He says that he performed his ministry 2 years before the earthquake. In the Hebrew, it's articulated, showing us that it was a particular earthquake, that people knew about it or they experienced it, or that they would know about it. So when they read his message, they would know, hey, he spoke about that earthquake, and it would happen a bit later. This earthquake is mentioned only here and in one other place in the Old Testament, so we have no clue as to when it was. However, we will come back to it and see what he may have been talking about. He tells us that his ministry was based on two things: what he saw and what he heard. We learn a lot about how inspiration works in the book of Amos. It's actually very important compared to any other book outside of the major prophets. And so it's very important for us to understand what is happening. He says that he heard the Lord's voice and he saw what was going to happen to Jerusalem. The Lord's voice will roar from Zion and thunder from Jerusalem, and then he will watch as the pastures of the shepherds. Remember, this is speaking about his own profession, how the land will be decimated. The pasture lands will dry up, and even the grass on Mount Carmel, which usually has a lot of water and therefore it's quite fertile, would wither and die. He is shown images of famine, images of pestilence, perhaps, that may have been brought on by human causes, like war or punishment from God. Okay, so let's talk about how the book itself works. First 2 chapters of the book follow a very specific formula that is not found anywhere else in the Bible by any other prophet or any other writer, both Old and New Testament, by the way. He would begin each section in these 2 chapters with an expression, Kol Amar Yahweh. By the way, sorry, that's not Ko, it should be Kol. I'll correct it later. Kol Amar Yahweh, roughly translated, Yahweh says, God says. And then this would be followed up by a mathematical formula, 3 plus 1. And this formula says for 3 sins of, and then it would name a nation. No, for 4 sins of, and then it would carry on. It was a formula of judgment. The only other place where we have kind of a similar formula is in Ecclesiastes about the generosity, to give portions to 7, never mind give portions to 8, 7 plus 1. But this is a judgment formula because the sins that are being punished, it's not any sin, but what is called pesha. This is the highest level of sin where forgiveness can still work. There is another level worse than this where there is no forgiveness. And then the third part of the formula says that there is no shuv, that God will not change his mind. The word shuv is normally translated as repent. So God will not repent. But a better understanding is the modern road sign, U-turn. So God has made up his mind. He is not going to U-turn. So the 3 plus 1 tells us that this horrible sins of this nation, this city, will be carried out, and God will not change his mind. He will not relent. We know in many of the other judgment passages of the Bible that God leaves open that little door that he could change his mind if the people would just change their attitude and listen. So if the people would shuv, make a U-turn, then God would shuv and change his mind. But in Amos, in these 2 chapters, which are really just a list of judgments against many different nations, God says, I'm not going to, even if you make a shuv, I will not shuv. It's kind of a double whammy. What God has decided as punishment will be carried out no matter what. The first target of this formula is the city of Damascus. We shall look at the individual prophecies later. The second is the city of Gaza. By the way, the name Gaza has stuck around for thousands of years, and it remains the same Gaza as it was in Bible times. Modern Gaza, which is used for that entire strip, is actually the territory of the Philistines. Okay, so this was the target here were the Philistines. Damascus is the same ancient city that is now the capital of Syria. It was always the capital of Syria all through history from Bible times. And so the target there is Syria. The next one is the city of Tyre. This was the main city in the country of Lebanon. It is not the main city of Lebanon today, but it is still one of the more important cities in Lebanon. And so what you have in these first 3 Pesha formula are 3 foreign nations north of Israel. So Syria, north and west of Israel. Syria, Philistines, and the Phoenicians or the Lebanese. And then the prophecies move to the south and east of the land of Israel. The kingdom of Edom, which is southeast of the land, the kingdom of Ammon, which is directly east of the land, and the kingdom of Moab. All of these in the modern map are in the country of Jordan. Now, what's important about these 3 as different from the first 3 is this. Edom is the country that came from Esau. Ammon and Moab came from Lot, the nephew of Abraham. So these are sister nations. These are cousin nations, if you like. Those first 3, those are foreign nations. These 3 are like sibling nations, if you like. However, the relationship between Israel with Edom, Ammon, and Moab was never a peaceful one. It was always a difficult one. They were always at war, or somebody would be against them, against Israel, one of them, or sometimes all of them. We read of times when the 3 of them would gang up against Israel, against Judah, like during the time of King Jehoshaphat. Then we have a prophecy against Judah. So for 3 sins of Judah, for 4 sins of Judah, I will not shuv, God says. And then the longer one is against Israel. So we know that the target here was the northern kingdom of Israel. That's the one that God would target the most. The remaining portion of chapter 2, from verses 9 to 16, provides for us reasons for the judgment of Israel. But again, here we have a special formula. It would give the reason and then end this up with what we call Nahum expression. This is very unique to the prophets. It doesn't appear anywhere outside the prophets. And Amos uses more of it proportionately than just about any other prophets, maybe with the exception of Isaiah. The Hebrew expression is Nahum Yahweh, which is rather difficult to translate. Some English Bibles have translated as this is what Yahweh declares, but both of them are nouns in Hebrew. So the translation of many versions is simply Yahweh's declaration or the Lord's declaration. This is found, as I said, in prophetic texts, and it's found twice here. So God explains the judgment and then says, like, Yahweh's declaration. It's almost like putting a stamp on the description as to why God is doing this and why they have no cause for a negotiation, no cause for court argument. They just simply have to accept. Now, in chapters 3, 4, and the first part of 5, we have a totally different structure. He was quite a writer for such a short book. He's constantly shifting how he presents his thoughts. Each of these chapters begins with the same phrase: listen to this word. It's almost as if, pay attention. This is what I'm telling you. This is the word of God. And if you don't listen to it, then you are going to suffer. So 3:1, 4:1, 5:1 begin with the same phrase: listen to this word. And throughout these 2.5 chapters, the messages are punctuated with these two expressions: either Yahweh has spoken, or Yahweh says, or Yahweh's declaration. So he would say a few lines and then Yahweh has spoken. Another few lines and another punctuation, Yahweh's declaration, back and forth. It's a very intriguing way of writing. Now, Isaiah does use a lot of this Nahum Yahweh, but when you consider the brevity of the book of Amos, this is quite a lot. It was very important for him, not being a professional prophet and therefore not acknowledged as a prophet by the people around, to be able to say, this is what God says. I'm not saying it to you. Two things about this expression: Yahweh says, Yahweh has spoken, Yahweh's declaration. Number one is it grants authority to the messages of the prophet. Number two is that the prophet speaks with certainty. There is no ambiguity about what he's saying. Even if the message is really difficult to swallow, message of judgment, he is saying, no, this is God speaking. So if there were any objections, if there were any complaints about what he's saying, he can say, look, this is not me saying, I'm just the mouthpiece. The main Hebrew word for prophet means a mouthpiece. I'm nothing. I'm just the vessel of the message. Now, of course, the people of Israel and Judah as well often attack the messengers. They couldn't attack the message. They couldn't debate or argue the message. So they would attack the messengers. In Amos's case, the high priest attempted to silence him. It didn't work, but at least the attempt was made. In chapter 3, he tells us that the primary audience are the Israelites. This is the northern kingdom, by the way, not referring to Judah. In chapter 4, we have this most unusual expression found nowhere else. He says that he's speaking to the cows of Bashan. Now, most Bible commentators agree that the reference to the cows of Bashan is a reference to the high society women of the northern kingdom. The reference to Mount Samaria, or the city of Samaria, would be speaking about the women in the courts of, like Jezebel, in the courts of of Israel. Now, why did he call them cows of Bashan? You know, I've studied Amos. I had an exam question for my PhD comprehensive entirely on the book of Amos, and I have not found a satisfactory explanation for why he called these high fashion, high ranking women of the northern kingdom as cows of Bashan. Now we know that Bashan, this is a part of the country of northern Israel that had rich pasture land. So they had a lot of cattle farms in that area. It is more or less the area we know today of as the Golan Heights, from that area stretching down into Galilee, into the northern kingdom. I think the only thing I can think of is that these women are like those cows in the Bashan territory. They had everything. They were well fed, they were overfed, life was easy, there was no struggle. They had the best of the kingdom, they lived in luxury, they ate in luxury, and so on. So he used a pejorative, if you like, term to describe these women. Now, we don't know much of why they are like that. We get some clues in his message, and we shall look at that later. But I think understanding Jezebel may give us a clue as to what these women were like, that they had a very prominent role in leading the northern kingdom of Israel away from the worship of Yahweh. Maybe a lot of these women were not even Israelites, like Jezebel was not. And they were brought into the kingdom, they brought their religions with them, and eventually the northern kingdom gave up the worship of Yahweh completely. And so this would be a kind of a put down on the part of the prophet. In chapter 5, he says that the target is the house of Israel, a lament for the house of Israel. Now, this would probably be a larger expression, incorporating not just the northern kingdom, but perhaps the southern kingdom as well, because some of the messages did target kingdom of Judah. In the next group of passages, we have this. There are two sets of prophecies that employ the lamenting word hoi in Hebrew. Now, the word hoi is usually translated as woe in most English Bibles, though you will see some other translations like alas, or it's over, or I'm done with. But we'll stick to the word woe because we are accustomed to that. Woe. Now, when Isaiah met God in that vision, this was his response. He says, really, woe to me. I am gone. I'm a man of unclean lips. So Isaiah may have adopted the prophecies from or the language from Amos, because Amos predates Isaiah by about 10 years or so. So the second half of chapter 5 begins with hoi, but ends with this very unusual names of God. Yahweh, whose name is God Sebaoth. The word Sebaoth means armies. So God Sebaoth means God of armies. Now, most of the time, the name Yahweh Sebaoth appears in the prophetic writings, in the Torah, in the Psalms. But Amos has a little twist to it. God Sebaoth. Now, Sebaoth is a military title. God is the generic term for God. So Elohim and Sebaoth being combined, when usually it is Yahweh and Sebaoth. So the God of creation is also the God of armies. And the armies that he's talking about here is really the destruction that God allows upon the nation. Well, we'll see that as we go along. In chapter 6, we begin with hoi, but then the chapter is twice punctuated with Naum Yahweh, Yahweh's declaration. This is one of the shortest sections in the book. It's not a happy section because whenever you hear the word hoi in Hebrew, that means really this is bad luck. It's like you are cursed. It's like you are hexed or something like that. It's the worst place to be in from a conceptual, philosophical, and spiritual point of view. In the next section, we encounter what he calls the visions. Now, we have to be a little careful because all the messages that they receive are known as visions. But he specifically targets these 5 visions. He uses the word vision as a descriptor for these 5 things that he saw. So now he moves away from just hearing, he now sees things. The first vision he has is the vision about locusts. And he uses the expression Adonai Yahweh, which is a redundancy. It means Lord, Lord. Adonai Yahweh showed me. When you are reading English Bibles, you need to pay attention to the preface or the introductory page that the printers put, because they tell you how they handle these names. So like the NLT, for example, translates Adonai Yahweh as the sovereign Lord. Okay. And you need to understand the translation you're using and therefore how they are handling the different names of God when they come in combination like this. And this is important for Amos because Amos is constantly blending these names of God. He sees locusts. Now, of course, the Israelites would be reminded of the locusts that they experienced in the past in Egypt, and maybe locusts that they have on a regular basis. This is one of the great agricultural problems of the Middle East until today, the attack of locusts, Middle East, North Africa. And then we have the second vision, which is a vision of fire. Again, using the same introduction that Adonai Yahweh showed me. Okay, so there's an emphasis on visual and sight here. He sees fire. Of course, in Israel's history, fire is all over the place. Moses met God in a fiery bush. When God descended on Mount Sinai, the mountain went up in flames. There was a fire punishment that raced through the camp of Israel and killed many of them because of their sin at Baal Peor. They saw fire, a pillar of fire that kept them warm and protected them from enemies at night for 40 years in the wilderness. They saw fire come down from heaven to light the first sacrifice offered on the altar of burnt offerings at both the tabernacle of Moses and the temple of Solomon. Many of them, closer time, would have seen or would see the fire of Elijah on Mount Carmel, or at least heard about it, though that would have been earlier than Amos himself. The third vision is one that is a little difficult for us to visualize because we don't do this anymore. But I can still remember this little gadget I saw as a kid growing up when people were making a wall or something around my little village. They had this, it's called a plumb line. It's basically a weighted object at the end of a string, and it enabled them to measure whether a wall is going up straight up or not, whether it's a 90-degree wall or it's vertical and it's straight up or leaning, whatever. And so he saw a plumb line, and he doesn't use Adonai Yahweh this time. He just says, he showed me, taking for granted that it is God who showed him the plumb line. And God asked him to measure. We will talk about that. And it is in this chapter that we meet this little clash between the so-called high priest Amaziah and Amos. When he challenged Amos, who do you think you are? Are you really a prophet? And Amos says, no, I'm not. I'm not a prophet or a son of a prophet, but I have a message from God. Imagine the courage of this man. He says, yeah, you're right. I'm not a prophet, but God has spoken through me anyway. This is like a modern day person who gets out on the pulpit and people are not happy with his message. And they say, who do you think you are? You're not a pastor. Yes, I'm not. But God has spoken through me. What would we do if we met somebody like Amos in our world, or walks into our church and gives a message that nobody wants to listen to? And the religious authority says, not him. He doesn't really speak for God. And he says, I do. I am speaking for God. But you're not really a minister, you're not really a prophet. Yes, I'm not, but I'm still speaking for God. So the book of Amos is very important because we don't have this kind of tete-a-tete anywhere else at this kind of level where a man could say, yes, I'm not a prophet, but I'm still speaking for God. The fourth vision is an interesting one. He says that Adonai Yahweh showed him a basket filled with summer fruit. Now, the main fruits in the land of Israel would have been figs, pomegranate, dates, grapes, olives. Okay. So all these fruits, they would not have had mangoes or bananas or melons, those are things that would come later to the land. And then he was told what all this would represent, what the fruits would represent, and what he must say to the people. So we are still dealing with visual. He says, I saw Adonai standing beside the altar. The altar here most likely refers to the altar of burnt offering. And the descriptions around it tell us it's that altar, not the little one inside the temple. And then the book ends up with this. After telling us these 5 visions, and they all seem to be related to judgment in some ways, then the book speaks about God is going to judge Israel, but then comes with a promise that there will be full restoration. And he punctuates this with 4 Kol Amar Adonai. Yahweh says, God says. The final piece of Amos is the assurance of restoration. He seems to imply that the people will be driven out of the land as a judgment of God, and this would be backed up by Isaiah and Jeremiah and the prophets that come after him. We would know it historically as the Babylonian exile or Babylonian captivity. But throughout all of these prophets, there is a promise of restoration of the land. This is one of the most difficult prophecies of the Bible because Christian scholars and Jewish scholars still debate, was that meant to be a physical reality or a spiritual reality? And looking at current world events, not just the current war, but the history of modern Zionism, the forming of the modern state of Israel, it's all predicated upon these promises. So when the Zionists looked at the possibility of establishing a state, a Jewish state, they did not choose any land. They chose the land that was promised to Abraham, that they saw as their spiritual right. Now, interestingly, not all the modern Zionists were religious people, but Jews all over know that that land was promised to them, and it was promised that no matter how many times they are displaced from the land, they would come back, they would be returned to the land. Now, when we look at Israel's history, this is what we see. Abraham arrives in Canaan. God says, this is your land. But a short time after that, he's off to Egypt because there was a famine. And it was only a run-in with the Pharaoh that led him to come back to the land. Same thing happened with Jacob and his family. A famine drove them out of the land, and they lived in Egypt for centuries. And then eventually came back. We know that as the Exodus. The Babylonian captivity and the Assyrian captivity means they were displaced from the land, but with Persian help, they came back to the land. The Romans, after 2 Jewish wars, even changed the name of the land, almost as if to say, this is no more yours. And for 2,000 years, it seemed that they had no land, but eventually they returned to the land. There are Christian scholars who are struggling with this concept because it's a theology known to Old Testament scholars as the gathering. Because in every one of these prophecies, including here in Amos, when God says that he will restore the fortunes of Israel, he describes about how he will gather them from all the four winds, from all the nations where they were scattered, and he will bring them back to the land. There are Christian scholars who believe that this is something eschatological, something future. It's not necessarily referring to that particular geography, but to the gathering of the nations in the final judgment. So more about maybe the New Jerusalem, the new creation. But it is something to consider because there is very little eschatological material in Amos. Abundance of it in Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Zechariah, and so on, but not so much in Amos. And so we have to keep that in mind as well. The book ends up with this simple little line: Yahweh, your God says. Remember, he's been challenged. They told him, who do you think you are? Who are you speaking for? And he says, Yahweh, your God. He doesn't use the term our God. It's almost like he is pointing fingers at the nation. The nation that had already rejected God. The kings had rejected God. The so-called priests had rejected God. The people had rejected God. And he says, no, your God is speaking. So I'm not the one speaking. I'm not saying anything. Your God is the one who's speaking. Now we've seen that he has a very unusual way of handling divine names. He uses the name Yahweh a lot, but very often in combination. For example, Adonai Yahweh, this total redundancy. If you translate in English, it's like saying Lord, Lord. But there's another way you can translate Adonai Yahweh in English. If you keep Yahweh as the proper name of God and translate Adonai with the proper English word today, it would be Sir Yahweh. Think of that system. Adonai is usually translated as Lord, but the comparative or the parallel word in today's English is the word Sir. So many of us men who are teachers here, we are called Sir. So Sir James, Sir Fanwar, Sir Samuel, or Sir Giri, or whatever. So he has this kind of adoration for God. He also used this triple combination that you seldom find outside the writings of Amos, this idea of Yahweh God Sebaoth. Usually it's just Yahweh Sebaoth. Where's the next one? And then you have this Yahweh God Sebaoth Adonai. I don't know of any other Old Testament book that uses all of these four primary titles of God in one sentence, in one listing like this. He's very unique in that sense. He also provides us some very unique information. Okay? One of those is this earthquake. Now, seismologists and geologists think that he is referring to this earthquake. It is named as the M subscript 1, and with a reading in today's seismography as probably an 8.2 event that took place sometime around 750 BC. This would be 10 years before Isaiah became or was called to be a prophet. Isaiah would have been just a teenager at this point. Now there is geological evidence of this earthquake, this major earthquake around this time in the Dead Sea area, which is part of the Rift Valley, one of the most active earthquake regions of the world that stretches from Israel all the way down into Northeast Africa, okay, the Rift Valley. And so some scholars believe that this is probably the earthquake that he was talking about. And so this might be the date, but we cannot be absolutely certain. He must have been an astronomer of sorts, because apart from the book of Job, Amos is the only book where we meet two major constellations that have captivated the attention of Adventists for a long time. One is the Seven Sisters constellation known as Pleiades. The other is the Hunter constellation known as Orion. Now, what's interesting about these, for those of you who know a little bit of astronomy, is that Orion is fairly easy to spot in the heavens because of this unique feature here known as Orion's belt, the 3 stars. When I was a kid, Adventists believe, including my father, that there is some kind of cosmic tunnel that is hidden in the belt of Orion, through which we will be traveling to that third heaven where God's throne is. If there is one, it's probably a black hole. Okay, so I don't think that this is the case. But if you can spot Orion and you have good eyes, then you can also find, because it is more or less in line with the belt of Orion, the 7 sisters. They are bluish, tiny little stars. They are clustered together. There are 7 of them. They're fairly dim, but if it's a dark night, which is never dark in Bangkok area, you can actually see them. If you go to Khao Kho or Doi Thanon and it's a clear night, then you probably would see them. In between Orion and Pleiades is a constellation with what is known as probably the largest star in the universe. Okay, and so this very small, innocuous little grouping, Pleiades, and this very famous hunter constellation. How did he know about them? What did he know about them? Or was it simply observing them in the sky? So it's a little bit of a mystery, but it does give us a clue that he probably watched the stars like David did. A man with animals out in the fields, he would have time to see this, and there were no electric lights in those days to obscure the vision. Then he tells us something that you don't find anywhere else in the Bible, the names of 2 gods. It seems that they are Babylonian gods. One is called Sikut, the other one is Kiyun. And scholars have not been able to identify who they might be. There are all kinds of suggestions about who this might be. What seems clear, because he does it in this context, is that they were some kind of astral deities, star gods of the Babylonians. We know that the Babylonians saw the stars as gods. That's why when they saw the star of Bethlehem, they believed that the gods were guiding them to a special place. And so they came, the Magi came from the east. Not just the Babylonians, the Persians were also stargazers. You don't hear much about stars among the Egyptians, but a lot about stars among Babylonians and, of course, the Persians. And then we have some historical information. He says that God brought the Israelites out from Egypt. Now, this is literally true. When they went into Egypt at the time of Jacob, they were not a nation yet. There were just 75 people, just a small little clan of shepherds. When they left Egypt, they were a nation of anywhere from 2 to 3 million people. So in a way, the Bible nation of Israel came out of Egypt. More importantly, we know the origins of the Philistines. This is not the only place. There's other places in the Old Testament that tell us that the Philistines come from Kaftor. Kaftor is the Bible name for the island of Crete. In other words, they are Europeans from the southern Europeans, Mediterranean regions. And it may not be just Crete alone. It could be Sardinia, it could be southern Italy, maybe even a little bit of Spain, but that whole region, that the Philistines came from there. And the reason for mentioning the Philistines here is that the Philistines remain as Israel's #1 enemy for all of their history. They never really disappeared from history for the people of Israel. Even David couldn't completely overcome them. He managed to suppress them. They rose back to power when the kingdoms broke apart into 2. And so they were always the thorn in Israel's heel, so to speak. Now, the modern word Palestine was invented by the Emperor Hadrian of Rome after he had put down the Jewish rebellion of the Kokba revolt. And so he changed the name of the land from Judea, which the Romans called at the time, to Palestina. And the province was called the Syria-Palestina province. And the word Palestina is derived from the word Philistines, or Palestine in Hebrew. It was Hadrian's way of showing the Jews that now you don't have any more right to this land. And they were dispersed from the land literally. He also tells us the origin of the Syrians, and this is problematic because we don't know where Kir is. There are some suggestions it's from Central Asia, other suggestions it's closer home to Syria, maybe the Caucasus Mountains or Western Iran, okay? But by the time they settle in the area we call Syria, they have retained that name all throughout history. So what you have here are three very ancient nations, neighbors and enemies of Israel, coming from different parts of the world. So Philistines came from Europe, Syrians came from the eastern part, from Asia, and Israel came from Africa, from Egypt. Now, what's interesting about that? Well, Europe were the descendants of Japheth. The ancient Near East, including the eastern part of the Syrians, that is Seth's territory. Africa is Ham's territory. And so this is very interesting. It's as if three representatives from the three descendants of of Noah would congregate into this land, and then there would be war for centuries between these three. Israel, Philistines, and the Syrians were at war almost nonstop throughout history. Not just then, but until today. It's a very intriguing thing to try and understand these prophecies and see them from our modern perspective and what's happening in our world today. But we'll consider them a little bit closer as we look at individual chapters. So if you have time between now and next Friday, please try and read Amos chapters 1 and 2, at least those prophecies about the nations. You can read till the end of chapter 2, including that caveat we saw. You'll find the messages are fairly repetitive, so it shouldn't take too long. They're all judgment messages. They all use a particular structure, but we will do some brief dissection about why each nation listed there is targeted by God. And that's what we will do next week. All right, let me